Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the third episode of our Beyond the Bridge Shipowners webinar series, where myself and my colleague, New York partner Daniel Pilarski, will discuss the recent updates in EU and US sanctions. And I will start with giving you an update on EU sanctions, and I will focus only and entirely on the recently adopted 20th sanctions package. By way of background and in an overview, what have we seen, what has happened? The 20th sanctions package was already announced by the EU on 6 February 2026. However, as some of you may know, it has been blocked by Hungary until the former Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, was voted out in the recent election. Hungary, as a member state of the EU, blocked the sanctions package. And why it was blocked is because the 20th sanctions package is kind of a turnaround point for the EU in terms of their approach to sanctions. It has several parts which, if we take a closer look, could be regarded, and that's a quote from a recent article I read in Germany, is that the EU takes the gloves off. What does it mean? The EU partly changes its approach. It becomes much more aggressive in terms of sanctions requirement, and it is to be expected that we see a major impact on the Russian oil and gas industry and the shipping industry in particular. What is the big deal, if you will? Well, the big deal is that for the first time, a full ban on maritime services to Russian-related crude oil and petroleum products is to be discussed, and there is an official wording included in the relevant sanctions section saying we are discussing this on a G7 level and we'll push for this. So it's not yet implemented, but the fact that the EU has this or is openly discussing and pushing for such a full ban is quite astonishing. Another major changing point, which will have an impact on the shipping market and requires action, is the new provision on tanker sales. The EU introduces a mandatory prohibition of resale to or transfer to Russia from tanker vessels. And having quite a bit of experience in the sales contracts of these agreements, and we have seen quite a few, in particular with regard to sanctions sections, what the EU now requires has previously, that means prior to 23 April 2026, would have been regarded as a major deal breaker to any vessel sale transaction. Then final point is the extraterritorial application, again, for the first time, of EU sanctions. What does it mean? The EU has made use of a circumvention provision and now has sanctioned certain items which are not that relevant for the shipping industry, but certain items to be shipped, transported, or exported from the EU to the Kyrgyz Republic. And the reason for that is that numbers show that since the war started and since the sanctions hit, the Kyrgyz Republic has drastically raised its imports from the EU and drastically raised its exports to Russia. So one could come to the idea that these items will be used, or these shipments will be used to circumvent EU sanctions. So thereby now the Kyrgyz Republic or shipping items to the Kyrgyz Republic is subject to sanctions. The second one is much more relevant to the shipping sector because for the first time ever, an oil terminal outside of Russia, the Karimun terminal in Indonesia, is subject to sanctions, to EU sanctions, prohibiting certain transactions with this terminal. And the reason is because it's been used in the past, or that's the meaning of the EU, for circumvention of Russian sanctions. And with regard to that is that the EU has also introduced quite a minor change as it looks at first sight to the regulations on asset-freed and designated entities. Facilitating circumvention of sanctions can now be used as or can now trigger to become yourself subject to an asset freeze. So if you circumvent sanction, it means that you cannot, just for the reason of circumventing sanction, on the EU's designated entities list, which is, again, quite a change. Next slide, please. Let's look at the parts in a bit more detail. As I said, full ban on maritime-related services to Russian crude oil is being discussed. The important point which I would like to highlight here is this is to be regarded as a very serious early warning from the EU to the markets. And what does that mean? We have seen in almost all EU sanctions which relate to, or which could have an impact on certain contracts, that the EU has given market participants time to implement these changes, so-called grandfathering periods. And we, as Watson Farley Williams, expect if the EU now implements this full ban on maritime services, it will not provide market customers with major grandfathering provisions or long fade-out timings just because they gave the market an early warning. What does it mean? That does mean chartering contracts need to be checked whether they allow a short-term termination amendment in case of implementation. The same applies to service and other contracts, including financing contracts. So if this is implemented, whether it will be implemented remains to be seen, but if this is implemented, it will be happening on a rather short term. And that means that every future deal regarding maritime services for Russian oil or Russian petroleum products within EU nexus requires utmost care and due diligence and check of the underlying contracts. Again, I would like to highlight that we must not expect any major grandfathering provisions. Next slide, please. We have restrictions on tanker sales. We had these already in the previous part of the sanctions, but now these have been quite materially expanded. All tanker sales to third countries, so when an EU entity sells a tanker, let's say to a Dubai entity, must now include a mandatory contractual clause prohibiting the resale or transfer to Russia. That's not all. The sellers are required to conduct a documented risk assessment of retransfer to Russia. That means you have to do a due diligence on your buyer and check whether there's any risk of them reselling or transferring that vessel, that tanker vessel, to Russia. And that must be documented. You must implement proportionate controls to mitigate those risks. That means, as I said, due diligence requirements, checks of available sanctions, directories, stuff like that. And finally, you have to notify the competent authority of the relevant member state immediately upon any such sale. And there you are required to provide quite a bit of information. Last but not least, the contractual prohibition must cascade. that means the third country purchaser must mirror it in any onward resale and require each subsequent acquirer to do so. That means if such a ship, which has been sold in the EU, will in the future end up in the Russian dark fleet, one way or the other, there has to be a breach of contract and thereby a breach of sanctions within the supply chain or within the chain. As I said, prior to the EU introducing this would have been a major deal breaker for any tanker sales agreement, and not because these tanker sales are all with the Russian angle, but just because any third country purchasers will tell you, well, I don't know what happens down the supply chain with any vessel I might sail. It's not my business. So we will see, but it shows that the EU, as I said in the beginning, takes off its gloves. And if you don't introduce these in your contracts, if you say, well, what do I do? Well, then it's a sanctions breach and a circumvention of sanctions. That's quite clear. Next slide, please. Last not least, the EU has strictened its rules for LNG tanker and icebreaking vessels and said it's prohibited to provide technical assistance, brokering services, or financing related to certain icebreaker vessels or LNG tankers. There is a certain period for Russian-flagged, Russian-certified, or Russian-owned managed LNG tankers. This applies since 25th of April. And for LNG tankers which are operating in Russia, which are for use in Russia, but not Russian flagged or owned, the ban applies from 1st January 2027. The ban on icebreakers applied from entry into force. That means from 23 of April. So that is relevant for all the services contracts on these specific types of vessels. And I know that at least for some of our clients, that means relevant changes. Next slide, please. What else has happened which is relevant for the shipping sector? Well, we have now new provisions with regard to the shadow fleet and circumvention prohibitions. That means 46 new vessels have been added to the shadow fleet lists and 11 have been removed, so that we now have 640 vessels which are listed as designated entities and are subject to an asset freeze. Quite importantly, also for the oil and gas industry, the ports of Murmansk and Tuapse in Russia, and as I originally said, the Karimun oil terminal in Indonesia have been added to the restricted port lists and are subject to transaction bans under Article 5 AE. And that's the same rules for example, the Primorsk terminal, which is subject to the same rules for those of you who might think, okay, but what does it mean in practice? Again, adding the first non-Russian port shows that the Russian sanctions do not apply to Russia alone anymore. And that means that additional due diligence and sanctions checks are required. And I would have loved to say it's getting better, or it's getting less complicated, or it's getting less friction in the market, but the opposite is true. So what we see is an EU who tries to strengthen and strengthen the hold on the sanctions against Russia. And on a personal note, the fact that the re-election in Hungary had shown the result or had the results it had, makes it more possible and more likely that we will see maybe an additional sanctions package, and that will then probably be introduced a bit quicker than we have seen this in previous sanctions discussions. With that, I finish my update on the 20th EU sanctions package and hand over to my colleague, Daniel Pilarski. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm going to be talking about recent updates to U.S. sanctions. When we say recent, that's a little bit vague, but generally speaking, I mean what I mean by that is sanctions imposed by the second Trump administration, which started in January of 2025. And there's a lot to talk about. Because I'm focusing on updates, I will generally assume some level of familiarity with pre-existing sanctions or sanctions generally. With that said, I just wanted to spend this one slide talking very briefly about how U.S. sanctions generally apply. U.S. sanctions apply to U.S. persons. Definition of U.S. persons, well, it varies a little bit. Typically, it means a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, any entity organized in the U.S. or any other person in the U.S., including U.S. branches of foreign entities. However, the U.S. authorities, specifically OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, has been very aggressive in imposing U.S. sanctions even on non-U.S. persons, both due to facilitation. Anytime there's any sort of U.S. nexus, and often the most common U.S. nexus is use of U.S. dollars, or sometimes even when there's no U.S. person involved at all, and it's just secondary sanctions. So what we've seen is very aggressive U.S. enforcement of U.S. sanctions worldwide, not just on U.S. persons. Very generally, U.S. sanctions programs say that you can't deal with specially designated nationals or SDNs, or an entity owned 50% or more by one or more SDNs. Now that's ownership, not control. Most U.S. sanctions programs are not comprehensive. What that means is that of the 30 plus, getting on towards 40 separate sanctions programs, many of them, while they may target a country or an activity, they don't target everything with respect to that country or activity. They just target sanctioned parties or certain specified sanctions transactions. But there are a few sanctions programs that are effectively comprehensive that prohibit all or almost all transactions with those sanctioned countries. The current list of those comprehensively sanctioned countries or territories are Cuba, Iran, and North Korea, those three countries, also certain Russian-occupied portions of Ukraine. Prior to 2025, Syria would have been on that list as well. I will talk about that in a little bit. Both Russia and Venezuela are subject to very extensive sanctions, although in the case of Venezuela, that's rapidly becoming less true. I'll talk about that. But they are not necessarily comprehensive sanctions. So with that as background, let's start about updates. Next slide, please. Starting with Russia, Max's presentation obviously focused solely on Russia because that's been by far the biggest EU sanctions target in the past 4 years. Similar to the EU, the US has imposed very extensive sanctions on Russia, starting way back in 2014, but then very significantly increasing in early 2022 with the Russian full-on invasion of Ukraine. When President Trump took office in January of 2025, certainly his administration suggested that there would be grounds for hope for peace with Russia. Almost a year and a quarter in, we still unfortunately do not see that. But for a while, President Trump was very much not imposing sanctions on Russia the way his predecessor, President Biden, did. That changed rather significantly in this past October when OFAC added Lukoil and Rosneft, two of the largest Russian oil majors, to the SDN list. So they are now the targets of U.S. sanctions. Meaning very generally, as I described before, U.S. persons, with some exceptions, can't have any dealings with them, and non-U.S. persons that deal with them may be at risk of secondary sanctions. There was a wind down license, but that has already expired, and that's no longer relevant. There is a license to continue dealing with them as necessary to deal with the Caspian Pipeline Consortium and other Kazakh oil as opposed to Russian oil. There are a few narrow licenses that relate to some of their subsidiaries. And then importantly, there is not necessarily for the shipping community for certain, but certainly for the energy community. There is a license to permit various parties to purchase the international operations of Lukoil effectively. Obviously, they're very significant international operations of Lukoil. The license essentially says that non-US parties can enter into transactions and even sign agreements with Lukoil for the sale of certain of its subsidiaries, as long as OFAC has final say and final authorization of the deal. So essentially, you have this general license to permit you to negotiate and even sign agreements, but final sign off has to go through OFAC. The current license is 131D. It's been extended many times. It currently will expire in 2 days, I suppose. We'll see if it continues to be extended. Unless and until there's a deal, I kind of expect that we will continue to see the extension. So what does that all mean? One license that I'm not listing here is there's a license to deal with Lukoil service stations. So for example, a car filling up on gas or petrol or whatever you call it, in various countries that continues to be legal. But we don't have something similar for example, tankers purchasing bunkers or something like that. So it generally means that as long as these sanctions are in place, even the non-US operations of Lukoil are in most cases off limits for US for all US parties, certainly for all transactions in US dollars, and then even non-US parties may be at risk of secondary sanctions. Next slide, please. There have been several temporary licenses for the maritime transport of oil and petroleum products from Russia, which relate to the ongoing war in Iran, and I will talk about that when I talk about Iran. So tabling that for the moment. But one question I wanted to ask is the price cap still relevant? At the end of 2022, the US, the EU, the UK all imposed this price cap mechanism that essentially it's attempted to split the difference with respect to Russian oil and petroleum products. The problem was that those Western countries and the G7 countries wanted to continue to have Russian oil and petroleum products flowing to the world because that benefited the world generally in the form of supply and relatively lower prices. On the other hand, they didn't want to enrich Russia and to feed Russia's war machine. So this compromise was this price cap. In the months after the price cap, it became apparent that various parties were perhaps abusing the price cap or circumventing the price cap. There was some tightening of it. There were some changes to it. There were various parties that were sanctioned for alleged violations of the price cap. The current status is, despite all of that, the US price cap remains in effect. Now, it's probably of a lot less relevance than it was a few years ago for several reasons. First of all, many Russian oil majors are now sanctioned. So, for example, if you're getting your oil from Rosneft or Lukoil, the price doesn't matter. It's still prohibited under US sanctions if there is this US nexus or secondary sanctions risk. But not all Russian oil companies are sanctioned. There remain some non-sanctioned Russian oil companies. The US price cap is still $60 per barrel for crude and then higher or lower for petroleum products, depending on the product. I know that the EU and the UK have lowered their price cap. The US did not, so there's now this price divergence, which is a little bit awkward. Current oil prices are obviously far higher than any of those numbers. And so at the moment, this might not be of less relevance, but obviously the price of oil is volatile. If the Iran war is wrapped up, if the Strait of Hormuz is opened, if things change, obviously things can change very quickly, and we might still see, or once again, see more relevance to the price cap. So I think the answer, but obviously all of this dovetails with Max's presentation of the impending EU sanctions on the Russian oil and petroleum industry, which may effectively vitiate the price cap, at least if there's any EU nexus, and then you start having these awkward conversations. If you have a party without an EU nexus or with less of an EU nexus, can they engage in this trade that might comply with the US sanctions but not on EU sanctions? It does become a difficult conversation to be had. Okay, that's all for Russia. Next slide, please. Venezuela. As background, starting in 2019, in the first Trump administration, we had very extensive U.S. sanctions on both the government of Venezuela and PDVSA, the state owned oil major. Those sanctions have kind of gone back and forth a little bit. They were slightly weakened under Obama, but then strengthened again. But then in January of this year, U.S. forces captured President Maduro, and the U.S. administration, perhaps certainly initially, but then shifting the focus to Iran and other geopolitical issues, has been very accommodating to the current presidency of Delcy Rodriguez. And what we've seen in the past few months is a very dramatic loosening of the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela. So we've seen many licenses. So the current structure is that all the sanctions generally remain in place, but there are many licenses that permit both U.S. and non-U.S. persons to deal with Venezuela in a manner that complies with the licenses, notwithstanding the existing sanctions. So I'm going to focus on 46 General License 46B, which was the first of them, and then we'll kind of briefly go through the others. But I say 46B, it's an amended version of the previous one. But essentially, it authorizes the transportation and other items related to transportation, but for ship owners, transportation is obviously the most important, of oil and petroleum and petrochemical products by an established U.S. entity. An established U.S. entity is defined as a U.S. entity formed on or before January 29th, 2025, which is a year before this came out. So the idea is OFAC doesn't want someone to form a new entity to do this. On the other hand, there's no requirement that this entity, this established U.S. entity, have been historically involved in oil. So if you happen to have formed a Delaware LLC, for example, that's just sitting dormant, and you form this prior to January of 2025, that could be your established U.S. entity, and you could deal with this. There are several other conditions for relying on the license. No unreasonable payment terms, no involvement by Russian, Iran, Iranian, Cuba, or Cuban and North Korean person. Iran, Cuba, and North Korea would have been prohibited anyway under U.S. sanctions in most cases. Russia, in most cases, would be prohibited, but hypothetically. And then no JVs with certain Chinese parties. Any payments made to a blocked person, such as PDVSA, in most cases must go into a special account. That's probably not of that much relevance to ship owners, because ship owners aren't usually, other than taxes, permits, and fees, which already have a license, ship owners in most cases aren't dealing directly with PDVSA. They're not dealing directly with sanctioned parties. They're dealing with their charterers, and it's their charterers issue that they're the ones who have to deal with this. And similarly, there are reporting requirements for transportation outside the U.S. In most cases, again, the ship owner is just going to be relying on their charterer to comply with these sanctions. So ultimately, this is a pretty broad license. It does have some conditions, but in most cases, as long as you comply with these steps, you can deal in PDVSA oil or petrochemical products and other government of Venezuela issues. Next slide, please. So just in case you couldn't, because for example, you don't have or don't want to form or don't want to acquire your established U.S. entity, there's another license, 50A. This applies to certain specified entities that already have significant operations with Venezuela. Similar conditions to 46B, but this is mostly for Chevron and a host of other oil majors that don't want the bother of having an established U.S. entity involved. A few other changes, but it's pretty much the same. And then finally, on March 18th of this year, when the Iran war was in full swing and oil prices had spiked, we saw essentially any activities involving PDVSA. So before it said it has to be, for example, it has to involve transportation of oil. There are certain conditions. Now it's just anything with PDVSA by an established U.S. entity is now prohibited, again, subject to several conditions. So essentially, they're trying to make this as broad as possible. What I would say with all of this is that 90 to 95% of all trade with Venezuela by both US and non-US parties, whether or not US dollars are involved, the vast majority of trade is now legal under US sanctions. It's still important to do the diligence. It's still important to make sure that you check all those boxes because those are the requirements of those licenses. And if you don't meet all of the requirements, technically it's prohibited. But in most cases, this is a very wide license. There are several other licenses involving Venezuela that I will speak to briefly. First of all, general license affluence to Venezuela ships from the U.S. To Venezuela. This was something that was prohibited, but it's now permitted, again, subject to several requirements. Next slide, please. We have this is more relevant for oil companies than ship owners, perhaps. But it's certainly it's something to keep an eye on, which is that the companies that want to continue to have these operations in Venezuela. When the sanctions came out in 2019, there was this long maintenance and wind down period and licenses for companies like Chevron that had various operations in Venezuela. So they were permitted to continue with their operations. Eventually, this was kind of changed to winding down and certainly no expansion. Now there are ongoing transactions with Venezuela relating to oil fields, etc., are now potentially authorized the with respect to existing oil fields. You can continue to deal with Venezuela as long as the contracts are governed by U.S. law, and again, similar requirements to those above. But the key thing is that no new entities or joint ventures, so for example, a party entering into a new contract would potentially not qualify under 48A. But you have 49A, General License 49A, which does permit even new entries into new contracts, new investment, new drilling, etc. Again, it's a little bit similar to what I said earlier regarding the contracts for Lukoil international acquisitions and disposals, where you are permitted to enter into negotiations and even enter into agreements with PDVSA for new exploration, for new investment, etc., as long as the ultimate performance remains subject to OFAC approval. So what this essentially means is that, again, there is a wide license permitting both U.S. and non-U.S. operators to enter into Venezuela, and it does seem as though that's being very broad. But again, it's the way this is all done is through licenses rather than just repealing the sanctions. And what that means, of course, is that anytime these licenses either expire without renewal or are revoked, that effectively means that once again we could see a return of these sanctions, which do technically remain in effect. So it's certainly something to keep an eye on. I obviously I think the bigger or the bigger issue for ship owners dealing with Venezuela is tanker owners. But it's not just tankers. There's similar licenses that apply to minerals by exported by Minervan, which is the state-owned mineral company, and it's similar to the licenses that we described again. So certain Venezuelan dry bulk operators wishing to engage in trade in Venezuela, to a large extent, that is now permitted as well. Again, you have to make sure that the licenses remain complied with. Next slide, please. Iran. So, unsurprisingly, with Iran, so first of all, Iran has been for a very long time the subject of fully comprehensive U.S. sanctions. Under the Biden administration, that didn't really change. Albeit going back further, the Obama administration, we saw the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, that was suspended and eventually pulled out of by the Trump administration, the first Trump administration. We did not see much change in this regard under Biden, but perhaps we saw a little bit less enforcement. So the substantive law was about the same, but the enforcement level might have changed a little bit. Unsurprisingly, with the second Trump administration, we've seen a return of the maximum pressure campaign, which is essentially not really a change in law, but a change in focus and enforcement. Just one thing that I wanted to talk about, because this came out yesterday. This is more important for financial institutions, I'd say, than for ship owners, but still, again, something to keep an eye on and something relevant for the market in general. So the way that we've seen this aggressive enforcement is certainly any ship carrying Iranian oil or petroleum products, refineries, so-called teapot refineries in China, are being sanctioned. Anyone having any significant oil trade or trade with sanctioned Iranian parties is at risk. That's not new. That's not surprising. And again, we've seen just a few days ago, we saw a significant Chinese teapot refinery sanctioned. Just yesterday, OFAC came out with an alert where they said essentially they highlight the risks in dealing with Chinese teapot refineries. But I'm just going to read this. They say foreign financial institutions and other non-U.S. entities risk exposure to U.S. sanctions for engaging in certain transactions or activities involving designated teapot refineries. That means if you're dealing with a sanctioned teapot refinery, that's you're at risk. That's not new. That makes sense. But then the sentence continues, or other actors operating in the Iranian petroleum sector. And then you say, really? And then it continues. Accordingly, financial institutions should take steps to ensure that they are not facilitating transactions involving designated teapot refineries, again, not a surprise, or other teapot refineries that may be importing Iranian oil, because this may expose the financial institutions to sanctions. That's a very broad and very scary sentence, because if you think through the implications of what that sentence means, it's not just if you would have said, I want to deal with this sanctioned Russian, Chinese teapot refinery, or I want to deal with Iranian oil, I would say you're taking on a pretty big risk, even if you don't have any U.S. ties or nexus. This is a big risk. That's not a surprise. What this sentence, if you read it quite literally, suggests is that it's on you as a foreign financial institution or even any other non-U.S. entity to not just check if your counterparty is on a sanctions list, but are they potentially dealing in sanctioned activity or with sanctioned oil? that's a very high diligence standard and a very hard to enforce diligence standard. I don't know how anyone would make that work. It may be that they just wrote that a little bit more broadly than they intended to. But it's if you read that quite literally, it's pretty scary. And I think we'll all have to see how that goes. One other side note, I'm talking about Iran here, but I don't have a slide here for China. The reason I don't is that, while we've seen various very significant export controls, U.S. export controls on China, very significant tariffs on China, obviously China has been a big focus of the Trump administration. We have not seen a lot of OFAC sanctions targeting China per se in the second Trump administration. We'll see if that changes, but at least for the moment, this is not an avenue that Trump has pursued with respect to China, other than, for example, in dealing with Iran, as we're talking about now. Okay, long segue on China, but getting back to Iran. Um, Obviously, all trade with Iran is subject to very extensive scrutiny and potentially very significant sanctions, whether or not there's a U.S. nexus. But what we have seen, which is interesting, is since the U.S. And Israeli war on Iran began in late February, we've seen we obviously saw Iran closing out the Strait of Hormuz. We saw multiple licenses designed to essentially to mitigate the spike in oil prices as a result of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And this largely focused on Russia, and it authorized the transportation of otherwise sanctioned crude oil and petroleum products that were already loaded onto vessels with respect to this date. So it's important to note, doesn't matter who the supplier is, doesn't matter if the vessel is sanctioned, doesn't matter if the price cap is complied with or not. All of this, if it complies with these licenses, it's sanctioned. So the first license just involved deliveries to India. That has already expired. There was another license, GL 134, that applied to Russian oil loaded onto vessels on or prior to March 12th, 2026. That's the date that the license was issued. Were authorized through April 11th. That one has expired because it's past April 11th, but there is a current one. It's 134B, and this applies to oil or petroleum products loaded on or before April 17th. So that's the date that this was issued, and this one expires May 16th. So the theory of this loading date is OFAC doesn't want to tell parties you can go to Russia and deal with sanctioned oil, but what they are willing to say effectively is if you took a pretty big risk, and or were part of the so-called shadow fleet and just didn't care about U.S. sanctions because you're violating U.S. sanctions anyways. If you're in this category where you're either a high risk taker or are already sanctioned, and you decided to violate U.S. sanctions on Russia by loading this oil, congratulations, you lucked out, and well, you might be sanctioned still, or continue to be sanctioned, or double sanctioned, whatever it is. But anyone dealing with you or dealing with your oil, they could potentially acquire this oil, or maybe pass this oil off on a ship-to-ship transfer, something like that. Again, it has this expiration date. It creates interesting and somewhat perverse incentives where you're essentially telling the market, you can't do this, but if you do this, you might be able to get away with it if we decide to issue this license. And then just to round out the somewhat ironic circle, we had a license, General License U for Iranian oil, which permits parties to deal in Iranian oil. This one has already expired. As of now, there is no replacement to this one. We don't know whether there will be, but again, I think the Trump administration fully appreciates the irony of rewarding parties that are dealing in sanctioned Iranian oil in order to further the U.S. war against Russia. Okay, that's all about Iran. Cuba. Cuba has, as with China, Cuba has seen a lot of focus by the Trump administration, but not in the sanctions area, and that's kind of interesting. Um, the U.S. has imposed a pretty comprehensive oil blockade on Cuba, but they did this through the means of threatened tariffs and other soft and somewhat hard pressure. They did not do this in the form of sanctions. Very briefly, Cuba does not really have a secondary sanctions component. So if you're a non-U.S. person and you avoid U.S. ties, in general, you can deal with Cuba under U.S. sanctions. But there are plenty of non-sanctions considerations, and they are relevant. What we did see, regarding Cuba is a recent license that came out in February, along with those other Venezuela licenses that essentially OFAC announced not a license, but a favorable licensing policy that if you want to deliver Venezuelan oil to Cuba, OFAC would look upon this favorably and likely grant a license, as long as you ensure that this oil only benefits the private sector. Similarly, frankly, the sale of U.S. oil to Cuba could potentially be licensed, and there have been licenses for that, as long as it benefits the private sector. That condition, however, is a very important condition because the way Cuba generally functions is it's very hard to ensure that any oil does not benefit the government in any way. Recently, a Russian tanker came in with or was granted permission to go into Cuba with some oil. We'll see where this goes again. But again, it's none of this is technically a question of sanctions law, and so it's just the truth is that in the case of sanctions, there's been very few changes with respect to Cuba. There remains this comprehensive embargo, and we'll see where this goes. Two changes worth mentioning very briefly that have happened at the very end of President Biden's presidency in January of 2025. He undid two things that Trump had done. So Trump permitted private actions under Title III of Helms-Burton, which essentially permits U.S. parties to sue non-U.S. companies who are trafficking in expropriated Cuban property that was expropriated after the Revolution of 1959. This has primarily been used against major cruise companies that are calling in Cuba on the grounds that they use the docks or port infrastructure, and that was taken away or illegally expropriated after 1959. There are various private lawsuits. So Biden did that, took that away for literally a couple weeks or so, or a few days or so, and then Trump immediately pushed it back. And similarly, Biden briefly removed Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, and Trump reinstated it. I would say it's interesting that Biden only did this at the very end of his presidency, at the time when it would effectively have no impact. But let's move on to, I believe, Syria. Okay. Syria, obviously at the end of President Biden's presidency, Bashar Assad's regime fell, and there is a new regime in Syria, which is certainly has much more friendly relations with the U.S. than the Assad regime did. As a result, on June 30th, 2025, President Trump unilaterally ended the U.S. sanctions regime against Syria. So Syria, as a country, is no longer subject to any or the target of any U.S. sanctions, either comprehensive sanctions or even non-comprehensive sanctions. There's a new regime which is called the Promoting Accountability for Assad and Regional Stabilization Sanctions. It's a little bit like other regimes for formerly sanctioned countries like Iraq and kind of like Libya, even kind of like the former Yugoslavia, where it's targeting certain parties that benefited the Assad regime. But as a country, Syria is not really the target of any U.S. sanctions. There was sanctions are generally imposed by OFAC, but there are also congressional sanctions, which are a little bit harder to repeal. There was the Caesar Act, which was passed by Congress. This was suspended by on the same date, June 30th, and it was formally repealed as a result of the change in Syria on December 18th. So what that means is that you have a lot of historic loan agreements, charter agreements, etc., that say all trade with Syria prohibited. There may be other reasons not to prohibit trade to Syria, but certainly from the standpoint of OFAC sanctions, Syria is just no longer the target of U.S. sanctions or of OFAC sanctions in that sense. One awkwardness, I've been talking about ship owners generally, but mostly focusing on tanker owners and a little bit dry bulk. I haven't really talked about container owners. In most cases, when we talk about ship owners, we focus on OFAC sanctions, but there's another aspect of U.S. sanctions, which is export controls imposed by BIS. These generally apply only to U.S. origin items. They tend to be more relevant, I'd say, for container operators, because if you're shipping containers full of U.S. stuff, they may be subject to these rules. Obviously, you can get representations and covenants from your charterers, but it's still something to pay attention to. So a bit of awkwardness is that Syria remained the target of very extensive U.S. export controls, which prohibited most U.S. items from being shipped to Syria, with exception. Those were largely repealed. Well, the very extensive export controls were repealed on September 2nd. So now technically, general U.S. origin items that don't fall into some other category are now subject to a license which permits them to be a ship to Syria. So things like chairs or other things that don't have a prohibited use and aren't used in some prohibited activity or aren't sensitive. Those kinds of things, if U.S. origin, can generally be exported to Syria. There are also license exceptions. There are favorable licensing policies for certain things. But Syria remains, unsurprisingly, perhaps one of the heavily restricted countries in terms of shipping sensitive goods. Obviously, things like weapons, things like sensitive electronics and things like that are subject to very extensive controls. And one other awkwardness is Syria is still a state sponsor of terrorism. They are officially listed. This mostly affects kind of government contracts, but every now and again you see an agreement that says we can't deal with state sponsors of terrorism, and that's one thing that has not changed. So Syria remains on that list, which may be of some relevance. Next slide. Okay, two more things, just wrapping up because we are running out of time. Back in 2019, it was really it started in 2018, then through 2020 in the first Trump administration, we saw a major Trump focus on the maritime industry. OFAC released various sometimes referred to as a name and shame list of vessels alleged to have traded with Iran or Syria. This was very awkward and difficult because technically these weren't on a quote unquote sanctions list, but the list was still relevant and out there, and anyone dealing with these sanctions could say, well, you seem like you're the target of sanctions, and then therefore we don't want to deal with this vessel, which became very, very awkward. This all culminated in 2020, in May of 2020, with this very extensive maritime advisory, which imposed. It was a little bit watered down from what had been drafted and came before, but it essentially had all these, essentially requirements regarding AIS, regarding various things, and it imposed all these requirements for lenders, for ship owners, for various parties. We've seen a bit of a scaling back, not so much of the substance of these advisories, but of the more specific requirements. So first of all, under the Biden administration in 2024, that name and shame list was finally repealed. And then just earlier this month, we saw a new maritime advisory, which, again, in terms of recommendations, is pretty similar to what came before. Parties are encouraged to maintain their AIS, their AIS transponders on. Parties are encouraged to do diligence with counterparties. Parties are encouraged to maintain records. All the basic requirements are still there. But what we did see a change was these are more in the language of general recommendations for activities rather than specific items. So what we sometimes, back in 2020, we sometimes saw these very specific items in loan agreements and charter agreements and things like this. It's now following this, especially this April 16th advisory, it's now, I'd say, far less important to have these very specific agreement items and more of a kind of general diligence policy. Okay, and last slide, I believe. Okay, I mentioned earlier, almost everything I just talked about had to do with OFAC sanctions, which is certainly of more relevance for ship owners. But as I said earlier, there is another U.S. regulatory entity, the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS. It falls under the Department of Commerce. It's a completely different building, different people, different rules. In most cases, the parties that are dealing with this are, again, weapons exporters, high tech, those kinds of things. That's where it's more relevant. But one interesting case where it was relevant is that there is something called the entity list, which provides that depending on the parties, but in most cases, parties on the entity list, which is a little bit like the OFAC SDN list, can't receive U.S. origin items. And again, what that means is that, for example, if you're a container owner and you're shipping to a party on the entity list, there may be some risk if there are any U.S. items that are being shipped to this entity on the entity list, and that could be a little bit scary, especially for container owners, for container ship owners. In September of 2025, sorry, the saving grace and the thing that we always would say, to save us a little bit, was to say, unlike the OFAC 50% rule, which applies to SDNs, excuse me, BIS didn't really have this 50% rule. So, for example, if you had a major Chinese company that was on the entity list, but you were shipping to a subsidiary of that company, you could say, well, I'm not dealing with the actual entity on the entity list. I'm dealing with its subsidiary. In September, BIS enacted this affiliates rule, which essentially was the same as the OFAC 50% rule. And this is now a bit scarier. And it means that that parties shipping to even to a subsidiary of an entity on the entity list now have to do diligence and see and potentially are at risk if there's any U.S. origin items. That rule, as part of the overall tariffs, port fees, etc. discussions with China, because this clearly was aimed at China, it was suspended for 1 year on November 10th. So it is no longer in effect. But unless anything changes, it is currently scheduled to go into effect once again on November 10th, 2026. Thank you very much. Final disclaimer, this presentation is not intended as legal advice. It's informational only. Thank you for joining us today. We hope this has been insightful. Should you have any questions, we would be more than happy for you to reach out to us personally. If you have missed the previous episodes in the series, you are able to catch up on them on our YouTube page. Thank you and goodbye.